Hello and welcome back to Fin 3040 Real Estate. Today we'll be doing the final chapter in this module, Chapter 24, which is Lecture 4, Part 2. We only have a few items to cover in Chapter 24, and it's a pretty brief chapter. Zoning, subdivision regulations, and building codes, and planning ahead for development, or city planning. So, zoning is just how the government, usually the county, wishes to separate parts of land for the purpose of controlling residential, commercial, and industrial sections. So generally, zoning is going to be covered in those three areas. There is a fourth item, which is agricultural zoning, i.e. zoning for the purpose of land. Okay? But in general, it's going to be those three: residential, commercial, and industrial. And within each zone, you can only build a specific type of building. You can only build houses in the residential, commercial, i.e. retail property within the commercial area, and industrial is going to be plants for manufacturing or utility services. Zoning laws also cover how big the buildings can be, how many people can be in the building. So if you ever see capacities listed on buildings, that's covered by zoning law, and how much of the building they can occupy within the lot of land. So in some areas, you may see zoning is different for residential properties. You'll see that the houses sit pretty far back from the road, and they only sit in the center of the lot of land, and around them is a lot of greenway, basically, a lot of grass. And the reason is zoning laws dictate that that has to occur. And that is actually to produce that very constant look of houses which have land around them and a building in the center, known as a suburban area, suburbia. Okay, so that's one way you might see it. You might also see just houses butted right up beside each other, so the houses actually share a common wall. And this is common in cities where you want to have individual housing units so people can live in their own homes, not multiple area dwellings. But there's not a lot of space. So they get rid of all of the surrounding areas in the land, and they just say, all right, put the houses' walls together. That conserves as much space as possible. We can get as many housing units for single-family homes in here as possible. And that's also part of zoning and how they can be restrictive. So the zoning laws tell us exactly what can go in there and what can't, and what may and may not go in there. And the reason for this is that, let's say you have a residential area and you have a very nice park, you've got a lot of greenway, you've got a lot of trees, maybe a river or a lake. That improves the value of the property significantly. And it would be a trouble if somebody came in and decided to put an industrial power plant right next to your house or right next to your neighborhood development, because it's going to have a smokestack, it'll spew carbon in the air, nobody wants that, it's not very good, and it will lower the property values. Or even so, somebody puts in an airport right next to yours. Well, now you've got sound pollution, and that will lower the value of your property. So that's not something that we really want. So we use zoning laws to keep people from putting, actually businesses, from putting areas which would not help the value of properties in other zones. And we also use zone buffering, or buffer zones. That is a strip of land that runs around the property of the zoning area, which keeps the industrial part from running right next to the residential area. A section of land is kept between them so that at least the industrial park is not that much in view, or the smoke that leaves the industrial park doesn't get into the residential area, and it helps to keep the area separate and clean. Along with zones, there are land use restrictions. Okay, as we said, there's problems with the type of buildings that can be built, but also within the residential zones alone, for example, you can have different types of restrictions. So you can have low-density housing and high-density housing. Low-density housing is where, in a given square mile, we only want to have, let's say, 100 people living in that square mile. That's low density. Or, like Tokyo, in a 1 square mile, we could have 1,000 people living there. That would be high density. And the way you determine that is, well, you can build large skyscrapers which increase the density of the land use per square mile. And if you're using low-density housing, that means you cannot use skyscrapers. And in certain residential zones, such as in New York, Tokyo, San Francisco, etc., you can have very high-density housing, i.e. skyscrapers, which just house thousands and thousands of people. Okay? They also have requirements on the size of the apartments that can be built. For example, you may have to have a minimum of 1,500 square feet of living space. That is the minimum size that can be used in building an apartment. It could be 600 square feet of space per bedroom, which means the minimum size of a bedroom must be 600 square feet. It could be minimum size of the living room or minimum size of a kitchen. It doesn't really matter what the law says, but these are the minimum restrictions that are incurring. These not only help to ensure good quality of living, but also reduce the density of housing. Remember that high-density housing often leads to more crime, so cities have an incentive to use low-density housing planning in order to reduce crime. There's also a thing called a setback ordinance, which is a rule that requires that a building's facade, or the outer edges of the perimeter of the building, must be a certain distance away from the road or the end of the lot. And that keeps from people from building right up to the road with their property and surrounding the entire lot with a building. 1, it allows for the extension and use of a sidewalk. 2, it allows for any emergency vehicles to park along the side of the road and attend to the building in the case of a fire or an emergency. So setback ordinances are extremely important, and if you build along the edge of the property and don't adhere to the setback ordinance, you can have your building torn down. Which is the next item we're going to, a building permit. Before you do any building whatsoever, you usually are required to get a building permit. You have to apply for it, you have to submit your plans, and it has to be approved by the building inspections office. If you do not, if you do not get the building permit, then you may continue to build the building, and the inspector may be driving by one day and say, I don't think I approved a permit for this building, I don't remember it. And you would be surprised what they remember. They go check in their office and they find out you didn't get a building permit, they'll come right back over, and one of two things will happen. They will either fine you for not getting a building permit and tell you to get it. If you refuse, they will simply come back with a bulldozer and tear it down. You have no right, typically, in the United States to build without a building permit because you have to follow building codes, which we'll get to in a little bit. So a building permit must be obtained in any case in which you're going to do construction. Now, many people think that they can get away without getting a building permit if they're going to do construction inside their house. And that is true until you actually go to sell the house. If you go to sell the house and there is a deed review, or the person trying to build the house asks for the blueprints and the blueprints do not match the building that's actually there, you can be fined. Okay, so be careful about not getting building permits and always make sure that you get them. They're not that expensive, so it's always the best idea just to follow the law in this case and get it done. In the case of commercial buildings, I have dealt with this personally. We went and put up a section of wall, and we did not think we needed a building permit because we were doing something on the inside, and it did not materially change the structure of the building. Building inspector was driving by, looked through the glass front windows and saw that we were constructing a wall, asked if we had a permit. We did not. I ended up paying $1,000 extra in fines for that wall. That wall simply would have cost me about $300 in total materials and fees for the construction workers, and approximately $50 more had I just obtained a building permit. So I spent $650 more on that single piece of wall just because I didn't get a permit. So it always pays to get a permit. It's going to be cheaper in the long run, trust me. Okay, other items you need to concern yourself with here are spot zoning, down zoning, and taking. So down zoning or spot zoning is, go back here, spot zoning is where a zoning board decides that they're going to take a piece of land that is in another zone and rezone it for a specific purpose. So let's say we've got a residential area. All of this is zoned residential, a very large section. And we're just going to take a small strip of land along a road and we're going to rezone that as commercial. The reason we might do this is because it's nice to have restaurants and laundromats, maybe a local grocery store, a gas station in the local area where residents live, because it makes it easy to get to those things in order to enjoy them. If you have a large residential area which is devoid of these amenities, it becomes quite difficult. Some of you may be familiar with Morgantown's Cheat Lake area. Even though it has some restaurants and I think 2 or 3 gas stations, the majority of items which people would enjoy for the purpose of living are actually in more closely downtown Morgantown, the closest being Suncrest. Okay, you've got to drive a good distance to get there. So it would be a good idea for someone to come along and zone out a section of Cheat Lake in order to declare it for commercial purposes. However, actually Cheat Lake is not incorporated, so there's no zoning there at all as far as what can be done. That's why you see these sort of hodgepodge areas where you have commercial and have residential. But there's an example of where it might be nice to actually have a section of area that it makes it easy to get to residential services that people can enjoy their goods. Instead, they have to drive a far distance to get to them. In areas of the South where suburbs are the norm, you've got large areas of lands covered in houses. And you may have to drive 15 minutes simply to get gas or to get groceries. And this is where this comes into play. It's good for the local municipality or county which governs the area to declare a spot zone, allow construction to go in for commercial zoning of grocery stores and gas stations, and that helps improve the quality of life for those residents. Downzoning is where a zoning board comes in and starts to rezone a place or spot zone an area. And what they're doing there is actually they know full well they don't need to rezone the area. But if they do rezone or they in place regulations on that property, then the property's value declines. And they can rezone or regulate so significantly that the property's value declines to zero. And you would think, well, that probably should be illegal, but unfortunately, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld that this is a legal thing to do by the zoning boards. They can come in, rezone, and place legal property regulations that make the value of the property approach zero. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, if you remember back to eminent domain and condemnation, they are required to pay market value for the property. So if you're the zoning board and you're in cahoots with your local planning division, which is often the case, you will come in and rezone the property, and then the planning division can make a very, very low ball market offer for the property under eminent domain. Of course, the individual who purchased the property is very upset about this because they're losing money on the property under the down zoning. They're going to lose property value. That's the down part. And they're going to have to accept the eminent domain because if they fight it, then it's just going to be taken from them at prevailing market rates, and the prevailing market rate of the property has been declined due to down zoning. So again, SCOTUS came in and said this is legal, and because of that, many states' legislatures have come back and created laws that say you cannot do this in our state. So they've blocked zoning boards from being able to do down zoning to protect residents and commercial real estate from that happening. This sort of behavior is known as taking. It is not technically eminent domain. Clarify the two there for yourself. Downzoning is where they place the new zones and regulations, it lowers the property value, and effectively leads to the local area taking the property. Okay? And again, many states have prohibited this action. Subdivision regulations are when a large landowner has a very large section of land, maybe 1,000 acres, 2,000 acres, and they want to split it up into individual lots and parcels and sell them out to people at a profit. In order to do that, they have to follow mapping requirements. Mapping there should be bold, I apologize for that. They have to follow these requirements and provide a plan to the local planning division, who then has to accept this plan. And once they accept this plan, which shows where all of the sewers, all the roads, the sanitation system, water lines are going to be constructed. It says how the land's going to be used, where the parcels will be divided up into. It provides metes and bound of the new parcel subdivision. It even sets aside land for schools or money for schools and parks if the residential community would be so large as to demand its own school. And also new services that would be required for the residential project. Once all of that plan is said and done, it gets approved. But until all of those things are said and done, it is not approved. And remember back to the recording point. You cannot sell property if there is no deed, okay? You could sell the whole thing, the whole 2,000 acres to an individual, one single deed, but you cannot redivide the property or subdivide the property and create new deeds without having the deeds recorded. And this is how the land office controls things. They will refuse to record the deed until you meet approval from their land division. So you must follow these mapping requirements, even though they're fairly restrictive. Remind yourself there what I've just said. You have to set aside land for a school or provide money for the purchase of land for a school. So you, the landowner, somehow have to provide money for a school because you want to sell the land to other individuals in order to make a profit. That is a very large expense, okay? So even though you have to require a very large expense here, they do not have to record your deed separation or subdivision until you meet their approval, okay? All right, building codes. Building codes are extremely important to follow because if you don't follow building codes in the modern society we live in, your building may collapse. And this was pretty common before. They would build buildings, didn't have any knowledge of how to build buildings. Previously, you had masonry workers who were pretty skilled. You had mason guilds and construction guilds and carpentry guilds. And they passed down information to each other. But when you come over to the United States, guilds were not a big thing. And a lot of information was lost, and a lot of people just kind of did what they thought that was appropriate, okay? and there was a large variation in what was constructed to be a strong building. Today, we have very strict building codes. Okay, if I remember correctly, a lot of these came about during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. So we had a very large renovation, not only in the food industry, but also in the building codes industry. Under Dung Bell tenements in New York, they were collapsing and causing fires. So building codes came into play at about that time. And all they say is you can't build floors that are not able to sustain the weight of the total capacity of the building. So if 100 people were allowed in the building at a time, and you built a floor that could only sustain the weight of 50 people, that's a problem. So these codes say you've got to build the floor this way in order to sustain the weight of the 100 people who are allowed to enter into the building at any given time. It also tells, well, the windows have to be this far apart. You can't put a gas line into multiple building units. So if you've got, for example, an apartment complex, you can't use a gas line in that. That's obvious to us today, but it wasn't then. For example, you've got a row of row houses, which are all, as we said before, connected by the same wall. If you've got a gas line running through them, okay, and one of them blows up, guess what? The entire row of houses is going to be gone within a few seconds. They're all going to blow up. That's how gas lines work. So the building code says if you're going to have these sort of buildings, they cannot have gas lines, which is why today many of you have electric in your apartments, you don't have gas. Most single-family homes have gas, they don't have electric. That's the reason. So these building codes are very constrictive, but they help protect us individuals. Construction workers and construction contractors have an incentive to cut corners. The contracts are pretty interesting. So a common thing for construction is that it takes a very long time to get things done. So what people got wise to doing is that, well, we can provide incentives to the contractor to get them to work faster. So they have an incentive, they got a fixed fee, they're going to be paid a fixed amount for the building. Okay? No more. That's generally how it works. There's a fixed amount. So keep that in mind. And then they're going to get paid a bonus if they complete the work earlier, and they will be feed, they'll get paid less if they delay the construction of the building longer than is expected. Okay? So think about that contract there. Does the contractor have an incentive to cut corners by using lower quality material, or simply not putting in as many beams and boards as they said they would? The obvious answer to that is yes. The contractor is going to incur the cost of the building materials, which they then transfer onto you under the construction contract. But if the contract is fixed, okay, they want to lower their costs by using less material or by cutting corners, okay, using less shades, layers of paint, for example. So if you called for 3 layers of paint in your construction, unless you're sitting in the room when they paint the walls, you have no way of knowing whether they use 3 layers of paint. So they could use 2. They just spread it very evenly. That'll cut down on the costs. I've even heard of foundation beams, which is where they drive beams into the ground in order to make sure that the foundation doesn't shift due to earth settling or things of this nature, maybe even if the building is built slightly over a swampy ground. I've heard of the contractor putting in where they were supposed to do 13 beams, they put in 8 beams instead. That'll save them on the money on the 5 beams. They still charge you for 13 beams, but they only put in 8. Okay? And what they do is they just put in the beams and quickly cover it up with the foundation. You have no way of knowing. Okay? So they will try and cut corners because they're going to get a fixed rate for their construction there. They want to lower their cost in order to stretch the margins more. They earn more money. So of course they want to do that. That's what the incentive creates. And then that incentive we said about in order to get them to build quickly. If we give them the incentive to build quickly by paying them more and the disincentive to delay building by doing things appropriately, then of course they're going to speed up the building process, which means that things are going to be done half-shoddedly or slipshod. Okay, they're not going to do them well. They're going to go as fast as possible to get things done, and who cares if a nail is out of place or a floorboard is not correctly fastened in. Maybe your floor in the building is a little bit warped. They don't care. As long as it looks good and it passes inspection, they're happy, they get paid. Okay, so they're also under they try to resist obtaining appropriate permits because permits are expensive. And the permits come with monitoring by building inspectors. They don't want to be monitors because monitored will show up where they thought, oh, you didn't place this many boards in here as you said you were going to use. The inspector will find that. So of course they don't want to get building permits either because that will increase monitoring and the building permits are expensive. So the construction contracts provide incentives for construction contractors and workers to effectively lower their costs and in the process do bad work. And that's what they're incentivized to do, so we can't really fault them for it. We had to come up with better contracts to deal with this. So a way that the government came up to deal with this was to set a standard building code, as we described before. Contractors have to follow them. If they get permits, the inspector enforces the following of these permits and these building codes and makes sure that the building is up to code rigorously for the safety of the public. Once all is said and done, the building is constructed, everything looks good, the contractor and inspector agree that it's up to code, a certificate of occupancy is provided to the owner of the building upon completion. And that says that you may now enter the building legally without a hard hat, effectively. Okay, with respect to urban planning, it is generally the case that we will create a master plan, okay? So a planning committee is created, and this planning committee goes out and they do a physical local land inspection to figure out what is actually here, and then they do an economic survey of the land to acquire areas in which they need to be planned. The economic survey basically tries to determine, well, what are we going to use with the land? What's the best use of that land? What will provide the greatest economic benefit? So you may have a large section of land, and if your area is predominantly agriculture, well, you want to save the best soil for your farms. That would be a good idea. They'll produce more crops that way. So you may zone out the best soil areas to the agricultural zoning area. And you may zone out the areas which are predominantly rock or stone underneath. They're not going to be good for farming because it's got to be tilled up and removed and placed with topsoil. You're going to rezone that for residential because rock and stone areas tend to be very good for foundations for homes, where you may place commercial zoning out for there. And perhaps somewhere where there's very undesirable land, okay, that's pretty flat, you may zone out for industrial because it's flat, it's easy to pave for a large industrial complex, but it's out of the way, it doesn't affect housing values in the residential planning area. But many cities, especially ones that were developed early on, did not have good master plans. And so they kind of developed in a sort of hodgepodge way. Some zoning board would say, oh, we were going to build new areas here. This looks like it's expanding here. We're going to put a residential zone, maybe some commercial, etc. Right beside another residential and commercial zone. They didn't sit and think, we should make this all one commercial zone and this area over here the residential zone. And so you've got these intermixing areas. And because you have to rezone over time, and again, rezoning means that you don't necessarily get the people who are already there out. They don't get kicked out. They are non-conforming, as your book calls them, okay? So they have non-conforming use. So if you rezone a section of agricultural land as residential, it doesn't immediately become residential land. It remains a farm until that farm dilapidates. And that could be within 100 years. It takes a very long time for buildings to naturally become valueless and then get demolished, okay? It's not a very quick process. So you have these intermixed areas of land use, and it's not often the best way to use land. It doesn't provide the greatest economic benefit. So it would behoove planners to use a master plan which looks 15 to 25 years into the future and says, this area is always going to be used for agriculture, this area is always going to be used for commercial benefit, and this area is going to be used for residential housing going forward. And we don't plan to change it. We actually plan to expand it outwards from this area in continuing these plans and not intermix them in complicated ways. So it's very interesting to look at zoning maps. If you take a look at them, for example, in the city of Morgantown, you'll see they're very complicated. They look more complicated than gerrymander voting maps, which are extremely complicated. And so there's some idea there that if we simplified the zoning, it would perhaps increase the economic value, and that's probably true. The zoning and the master plan should be very flexible and have foresight into the complexities that might develop. Okay? It should not be short-sighted. It should say 25 years down the road, this is likely to happen in this area, and so we need to plan for that. It should not go, this is what we want for tomorrow. Okay, we want done next year, next 5 years. So we're going to plan for that and forget 25, 50, 60 years down the road. It should be very long-term looking. Okay. That's all we have for Chapter 24. As a reminder, your exam closes on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. You need to open the exam by 10 p.m. or it will not let you take the exam because you have 2 hours to take it and you need a full 2 hours before the due time in order to complete the exam. So make sure you start that early enough. Have a good day.